Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this week's International Macro History online seminar series. And today we are fortunate to have Noel Johnson, who is going to talk to us about the economic impact of the Black Death, something which is very topical now to talk about pandemics. He'll be joined by his co-author, Rami Jawab, who will answer some of the Q&As as we go along. Hopefully the third co-author will join us over soon. I'd like to remind everybody the rules of the seminar. So we have an initial 40 minutes of uninterrupted presentation by Noel. You can ask questions, raise questions in the Q&A button. Do not use the chat. Please use the Q&A button. Clarification questions will be answered as soon as possible by one of the co-authors, and the more substantial questions will be presented in the last 20 minutes of the seminar, where we'll have a Q&A session. After the hour, the seminar will formally end, and we'll continue with another 15 minutes of an informal Q&A session with the authors. So without further ado, I give the floor to Noel, who's, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Nathan, and thanks both to you and to Rui for inviting us to give this talk. So let me bring up the presentation. There we go. Okay, so today I'm going to do something, it's a little different for me. I've never presented a survey paper before, but I'm glad to have the opportunity to do it. And so I decided one of the best things to do would be I'll focus on some of the work that Remy, Mark, and I have been doing on the Black Death recently. Okay, so as you all already know, the paper that I'm going to be talking about is forthcoming in the Journal of Economic Literature. When the lockdown started in the United States back in March of last year, we were asked by the editor of the Journal of Economic Literature to put together a symposium on epidemic diseases in economic history. And so I encourage you to check out not only our paper, but also the one on the 1918 influenza by Brian Beach, Karen Clay, and Martin Saavedra. There's another one by Guido Alfani on epidemics and inequality. And then there's one by David Bloom and co-authors on modern infectious diseases. And while you're there, you could also check out the book review of the book Mark and I wrote on Persecution and Toleration, The Long Road to Religious Freedom by Shreya Iyer, which I put down there. Okay, so the Black Death, as most of you already know, it occurred between 1347 and 1352 in Europe. It killed about 40% of the European population, which makes it one of the largest demographic shocks in history. There is a vast literature that has been growing even more quickly recently, because a lot of people are obviously getting interested in these topics now. But even before COVID hit, this was a vast literature that I will certainly not do justice to everybody's work in it. But what I'm going to use as my wedge, to get in on this is that despite this vast literature, we know relatively little about its spatial effects, because there has not been consistent data that we can use at a local level on mortality. So, and that's what I'm going to focus on in this talk, is some of the research that my co-authors and I have done that exploit city-level mortality rates to discuss some of these, to investigate some of these spatial effects. So specifically, this is what I'm going to try to hit in 40 minutes, and I hopefully will get to all of it, but probably not the last one. But what I'm going to do is give you some general background. Then I'm going to discuss the randomness of city-level mortality. Then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we're going to term after Steve Broadberry, the Smithian effects of the Black Death, as opposed to the Malthusian effects. Then we'll talk a little bit about the urban recovery and what factors affected city recovery. Then I will talk to you a little bit about some research that is in progress that we're working on. We mentioned the state formation stuff in the JEL piece, but then there's also some work we've been doing on the relationship between the Black Death and guilds as well. And I'm almost sure I won't have time to talk to you about Jewish persecution during the Black Death. But if you want to learn more about that, we have a paper in the Journal of Economic Growth on it. So Okay, so some general background. These are Black Death mortality rates for 274 localities that we can get estimates on them from. The primary source for this is coming from a guy named Christakos, who does work on epidemiology, who collected it from all sorts of historical sources and then did various things to try to check that they were as good estimates as they could be. The thing to take away from here is first, the mortality rates are going, between 0 and close to 100%. Often if the mortality rate goes up to 80% or so, the city's just going to go away potentially. You can see that there's not a particularly large cluster of just high or just low in Europe. There seems to be no systematic pattern there. Might be easier to try to visualize what the spatial distribution is by looking at this. This is basically the average mortality surface based on those point estimates of mortality using an inverse distance weighting procedure. And so basically this can give you some idea of the regional variation that's existing. In particular, you can see that Central Europe, has relatively low rates. But they tend to be higher in the south of England and so forth. So that's just another way of visualizing what these mortality rates look like. So where did the Black Death come from and how did it spread? Its point of entry into Europe was in Messina, and it happened in October of 1347. So it's coming in, via the Baltic through the south, through the Mediterranean and into southern Europe. And you can see one thing to notice here, if you look at its spread, it's not just going straight in a flat pattern north. It's jumping, right? So London gets hit relatively early, whereas you have like places like Basel. It takes quite a long time, right? To get there. And so on. So this is the disease contagion process for the Black Death. So it's a bacterial infection, Yersinia pestis, and we think it was black rats were infected with it. Okay, and then they travel on boats and carts from Asia. They infect European rats, that then in turn affect other European rats. Fleas are on the rats, and they will drink the rat's blood, and then the bacterium will engorge their esophagus, so they can no longer feed, and so they start starving, and they go crazy. They jump off the rat, and start biting everything. If they bite, a human, then that enters the bloodstream, and then that can be bubonic plague that's entering them. Recent research, there's also some evidence that the fleas, can also be directly jumping between humans as well. Doesn't have to just be rats. There's also, that's bubonic plague. There also can be pneumonic plague, and as the name suggests, that's coming through the lungs and being transmitted that way. And that's much more virulent. The historians and epidemiologists, the consensus right now is that it was primarily bubonic plague that was taking place between 1347 and 1352 in Europe. Okay, some nasty slides. So the symptoms, are very bad. You get these buboes, black warts, you start coughing up blood and have seizures. And if you contract the bubonic plague, then mortality rate is around 50%. Okay, so why study the Black Death? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but one of the ones that we would like to emphasize today is that, well, first of all, this is just a huge demographic shock. And if you're looking around to test things, right, that rely on demographic shocks, this one has some nice characteristics for us. In particular, it's acute, okay? Meaning that even during the 1347 to 52 period, the Black Death will come to a city, it will hit once, right? And then it will take an amount of time to go through the population that's proportional to the size of the population, but it doesn't come back during that 1347 to 52 period. There are recurrences later, but they are much less severe. Like, they go on until the 18th century, right? These plague recurrences. And there's a data set by a guy named Birabin, which contains information on the extensive margin about those recurrences. The Black Death is only killing people. It's not destroying infrastructure. So if you want to test things on, for example, like, why cities are where they are, right? That kind of literature, then you don't have to worry about, say, like you're bombing bridges and things like this, which could also impact trying to measure something like increasing returns, right? So it's a relatively indiscriminate shock. So it's not explicitly targeting a subgroup of the population like intellectuals or a particular ethnic group. So there's another large literature on those sorts of shocks. And then there's also no government or international organization sponsored aid in the aftermath. So we don't have to, as it were, worry about that if we want to test some theories. So these are well-known data on GDP. This is England, GDP per person brought together by Broadberry, real wages, those are Allen data, and then there's also data on population of England here. And this is an example of the kind of aggregate data that a lot of people have worked with previously. And I just want to point out a couple things in here. I always forget if you can see my cursor, but if you look around the year 1350, okay, you can see the population drop. If you look at the real wage line, which is the solid black line, you can see the real wages actually decrease at first before doing the well-known thing of increasing massively, right? This Malthusian effect of the Black Death, which a lot of people have written about. But I'd like you to pay attention to that because we'll have some evidence from cities which is consistent with what we might call a Smithian or market disruption or disintermediation that's taking place in the, I'll call it the medium term after the Black Death, like the first 50 years after it strikes. The other thing to notice here is that wages and population, or population is recovering by around 1600 or so, and the wages are also have declined back, to a slightly higher point in England, right, than where they were by 1600 or so. So the long run recovery is taking about 250 years there. So, and we have data, we have similar pictures in the paper for Italy and Spain. And I should mention that Spain followed a slightly different pattern for reasons that we discuss in the paper. So the city level data that I'm going to be talking to you for most of the rest of this talk are going to be consistent with those country level patterns that we observe. And I'll show you that by giving you some regression results for a very simple regression. If we take the data that I showed you in the map before, and then we can estimate the percentage change in the, as a dependent variable, percentage change in the population of a city I between 1300 and some year, like 1400, 1500, so on. And then on the right-hand side, we will have the Black Death mortality rate for that city I, okay? Then beta T is going to be the coefficient that we're focused on, okay? We just put a T on that because to remind us that we're looking at the growth rate over that time period. And then we could put control variables in there, which I'm not going to do much for this presentation. Okay, so by construction, beta T is going to be -1 in the very short run. So that is, if you see a 10% Black Death mortality rate, then the population should shrink by 10%, okay? So if we look at the betas that we estimate here, and you look at the far left column, and I can actually do this. How do I draw? There we go. That's what I want. Oh, no, it's not going to work. So I'm going to skip that. So if you look at the column 1, right, then you can see the beta coefficient. That's for the growth rate between 1300 and 1400, and the beta coefficient estimated is -0.87. Mortality rates are measured here as 1, 2, 3 up to 100. And so this means if you have a 10% Black Death mortality rate, then your city has shrunk by 8.7% by 1400. That is 50 years after the Black Death has struck. What this suggests is that on average, the city level recovery is quite slow in this medium term, those 50 years. If you look at columns 2 and columns 3, that's looking at the impact of the Black Death mortality at the city level on the growth rate of the city between 1300 and 1500 in column 2 and 1300 and 1600 in column 3. And if you focus on column 3, you can see that basically we're estimating a statistical zero there. So there's no average effect, in by 1600. Okay, the aggregate recovery has occurred. However, I would like you to pay attention to the confidence interval, which is given in brackets down there. And basically, or you can just look at the standard error, like the estimate is very imprecise. So there's a lot of spread, okay? And we're going to return to this. This could be for a couple of reasons. It could be measurement error, but I'm going to argue that it's also that you have these permutations in cities. That is, some cities are not recovering much and other cities are doing better. And this is going to be related to basically a fixed factor. We call them fixed factors, for the cities, but it's things like, are you on a river? Are you on the sea? Are you a member of the Hanseatic League? A lot of things that are related to trade potential that are these fixed factors for the cities. We'll get to that. Okay, so those are the two things I want to bring out from that table. So what I want to talk to you now is we've done a lot of work trying to investigate whether or not these city level mortality rates are random or if they're correlated with something important that we should be paying attention to. So the first thing people often wonder and they expect is that the city level mortality rates are going to be related to the population of the city. For some reason, and I include myself here, the prior many people have is that mortality rates are going to be higher in places that are bigger. But what we find is that that's not the case. The log population in 1300 for a city is on the x-axis here. And on the y-axis is the Black Death mortality rate. And there's just no correlation. And that's borne out if you run a regression on it. Another thing that people will often expect about the mortality rates is that they will be correlated somehow with trade or trade potential. We don't actually have explicit trade flows, but we can measure trade potential by calculating the market access for every city that we have in our sample. And when we do this, I won't go into discussing what market access is exactly, but you can think of it as the weighted sum of the populations of all the cities around a given city, and the weight is decreasing with the distance of a city from the city you're calculating the number for. So other cities are basically markets for selling one's goods, and it's also a place where you can hire factors. And so there's a large literature in trade, right, that discusses how market access can be a sufficient statistic for the potential trade that you have with other places. So we calculate that, and when we look at the relationship between market access and the mortality rates, we also see nothing is there, okay? So we can do this for a large number of observables that we collect data on. And the basic story, these are all just these are all the beta coefficients where you're trying to have on the left-hand side, we have the mortality rate for cities, and on the right-hand side is the value of the variable, right? And basically we're estimating zero relationship between almost all these things. The one that does show up is going to be latitude. And that is going to be related to the fact that the mortality rates are going to be the higher the earlier that you get hit by the Black Death. Okay, that is the virulence of the disease is going to go down over time. And of course, it's coming in through the Mediterranean, and so latitude is correlated. If we had bishoprics in there, they would also be slightly correlated because they are correlated with latitude. Okay. All right, one last thing that I'll mention about the about the mortality rates is we can do a placebo test. That is, look if the city level mortality rates are related to the growth of that city between 1100 and 1200 or between 1200 and 1300. And that those regressions are in columns 6 and 7 here. And those are doing exactly what we hope they would do. They're showing no relationship. Okay. So we think that these mortality rates for our purposes are plausibly random. And so then we can do things with them. And one of the things I want to show you that we do, and that's mentioned in the JEL paper, only in the text though, this table is not in that. In fact, none of these regression tables are in that paper. It's a survey paper, but we have a working paper where a lot of these are there. But one of the things I want to show you is that there is a discussion in the literature about whether or not the Black Death had a huge disruptive effect in the early years when it hit, or whether it was Smithian all the way, right? And you just had increases in GDP per person and real wages, and that's the effect that we should be focused on. It might be the effect we should be focused on for certain purposes, but with our data, we do have the ability to look more carefully than I think a lot of other people have been able to do previously at what was the potential disintermediation effects, like in the short run. And one way for us to do this is to focus on what we call these aggregate effects. So what do we have here? We have as a dependent variable the percentage change in total city population between 1300 and 1400, always, okay? And then for columns 1 through 5. And then in column 1, that's just repeating the regression that I showed you, the first one, okay, the baseline one, where we have these 165 cities, which by the way is the intersection of the data we have on city populations with the data we have on mortality rates. So 274 and the BIROC data set, you get 165 cities, which is a large proportion of the European population at the time. And so that's what column 1 is. So that's just showing you that if your city had a 10% mortality rate, then you shrank by 8.7% between 1300 and 1400. Column 2 is taking historical states based on a 1300 map from, it's the Newsley maps, for what the administrative regions are. And there are 68 of those. And then for those 68 historical states, calculate the average mortality rate, okay, that you get from the cities that we have in those states. And then look at what the impact of the average state mortality rate is on growth between 1300 and 1400. And the story there is that if your average mortality rate is 10%, then you actually are shrinking by 11.5%, okay, instead of 8.7% between 1300 and 1400. If you do this in column 3 using what we call state total, that's allowing for cities that emerged between 1300 and 1400 to be included in the data set, then this effect gets bigger, okay? So it's suggesting 10% mortality rate, you shrink by about 15%, okay, between 1300 and 1400. And then we could also use modern countries in columns 4 and 5 to do a similar exercise. So the story that I'd like you to take from here is that this is basically saying there were these that this is suggesting this kind of disruption that's been mentioned in the literature, and the harder hit the people around you were, then the worse it was for you as well, right? Is what these regressions are telling us, we think. Okay, so we can do one other thing here. Let me make sure the time is on my side. Yep, okay. So I'm going to talk to you about column 6 and column 7 in this table. And what we're doing there is we're looking at if a region has a higher Black Death mortality rate, then are you less likely to see the emergence of a city as well between 1300 and 1400? And to do that, what did I do here? Oh, sorry. First thing I should mention, if we do the same exercise as in columns 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right, that we just talked about, if we do that for the period 1300 to 1600, so look at the long run growth, then there's no impact. So these are strictly speaking, like I would call the medium term effects, like 50 years or so, after the Black Death hits. By 1500 or 1600, this is no longer happening. But let's talk about the emergence of cities. So we can take our 274 observations of Black Death mortality rates, and then what we can do is, I showed you a version of this before, in fact, it should be the same version. We can create an inverse distance weighted surface using cross-validation techniques to get the optimal weight in order to calculate it. And then from this, you can combine it with where we know, like, there's eventually going to be a city, right? From the BioRock data set. And then we can, we can extract the mortality rates for those locations. And then we can test whether places with higher mortality rates see less city formation in the places where we know that cities could form, okay, at some point. And column 6 is basically telling us there that 10% higher mortality rates, there's a dummy variable there, do you exist in 1400? So 2% less likely to see a city coming out. If we do this in terms of populations, you're likely to see 4% less of the population emerging there. Okay, so this seems like the Black Death in this medium run also discourage city formation where there was higher mortality rates. Okay. I do have time for this. Nope, I don't have time for this. So I'm going to skip that. I'm going to talk about permutations, okay, in the Black Death recovery. So one of the things that we have and the data are showing is that there was aggregate recovery by 1600 or so. But what we can look at here, this is the rank on the x-axis of the cities in 1300 by their populations, right? So if you're number 1, you're big, that's Paris, right? If you're number 160, you're small, okay? So that's your ordinal ranking. And then on the y-axis is your ordinal ranking by population in 1600. And we can see there's a lot of movement through these rankings. If all the cities had just snapped right back, right, to where they were, before the Black Death, then the red 45-degree line, more or less, they'd all be lined up on it. The dashed line there is just a fitted line. We probably don't need that there. The red line is a 45-degree line. So there's a lot of permutations. And so is there anything that we can say about why some places do better and some places do worse? Why do some places recover and some places not as much? Here, I've just taken the liberty of pointing out one thing to tell you some stories about one thing that we find did matter a lot, and that is if you were in the trade network known as the Hanseatic League when the Black Death hit. So if you, again, look at that red 45-degree line, cities that are below that line are cities that are doing better after the Black Death than they did before. Okay, their rank is becoming lower, as it were. They're becoming bigger. The cities above that 45-degree line, the red one, they're doing worse, okay? And I've just circled some of the big cities in the Hanseatic League are in orange below the red line, like Braunschweig, Hamburg, Magdeburg, Wismar. I've also circled in orange above the 45-degree line some cities that were not in the Hanseatic League, like Trier, Winchester, and Mainz. And we're going to see this systematically in the regressions we run. Erfurt and Lübeck are ones that don't fit that story, but on average, it does. So there are 4 possible sources of recovery, we think. One would be agglomeration effects. And by agglomeration effects, we mean there could be increasing returns to having people in an urban location. If the Black Death is severe enough in that location, the returns could go down low enough that people just move to another location. So that's one pure population effect that could dictate, that you have that the city recovers or doesn't recover. Institutions could matter, like are you a seat of government? Are you in a relatively large monarchy? Are you in a very small state? We're rural fixed factors and urban fixed factors. So rural fixed factors will be things like the pastoral suitability of your land, other measures of the suitability for agriculture of your land. It could be things like, are you on a river? Are you on a sea? And then urban fixed factors, we think of things as like, are you in the Hanseatic League? Would be an example of one. And then we estimate regressions that look like there that we wrote down. We're basically just interacting the fixed factor with the mortality rate, and then of course including each of the components of that interaction in the regression. And then we're investigating population growth as usual on the left-hand side. And we are going to include, and when I show you the regression table right here, we're reporting that theta coefficient, the interaction, okay? And we're running regressions that include all of our candidates, for affecting recovery at the same time, okay? So when we do this, I'll just pick out some that we can see. Being on the coast is really important, okay? You can see between 1400 and 2015. And here I really should be able to, oh, there we go, yeah. So being on the coast, okay, right here. Being on a river starts to kick in by 1700 or so. I'm sure somebody's going to want to yell at us about potato suitability. Actually seems to matter after 1700 as well, which we do have some stories for. Being in the Hanseatic League matters a lot, okay? If you just look at the population of the city in 1353, that doesn't seem to do much. And these institutional variables, are you in a monarchy? Are you a state capital? Do you have a representative body in 1300? They also don't show up, okay? So the pastoral suitability, which I forgot to mention, but that also shows up as mattering, and it shows up in a negative way. So the better your land was for pastoral agriculture, the slower you recovered. That's actually consistent with some historical evidence. Why do these things stick here? Clear. There we go. So Sir Thomas More said in Utopia, your sheep that commonly are so meek and so little now, as I hear, they have become so greedy and fierce that they devour men themselves. This is, we believe, a nod, towards what we're finding in these data to some extent, that, people will, if the higher the mortality rate, they'll go and they will start doing pastoral agriculture if the land is suitable for it. And that is taking away from urban growth. Something else, if we just calculate the beta coefficients on all, so the standardized betas on all those regressions, and then we just sum them, we can see that the things that were in the red box, up here, they explain, there's what we call the fixed factors. They're explaining a lot more of the recovery than like institutions or that population effect. No, I'm not going to do that one. And then the last thing on this topic that I'll mention, and then I have a few minutes to get through, like 5 minutes to get through the rest of the stuff, is that if you think about, there could have been an urban reset, right, from the Black Death as well, by which we mean potentially population shifted from less optimal to more optimal locations as a result of the shock, the demographic shock that encouraged people to move. For various reasons. We do find, I'm not going to call it evidence, but we find some suggestion that this might be true. It's a very hard thing to test. So if you look at here, this is between 1300 and 2000, the population share along a river, okay, of the 165 cities that we focus on. The unconditional share, just calculating the population share, is the black line. But then we could, using our estimated recovery effect from rivers, we actually get a fairly similar match there, that the Black Death contributed, right, to this happening. Places that were on a river recovered much faster and more completely, fully. They grew beyond where they were relative to places that weren't on a river. And that is consistent with what we're estimating in our regressions. Okay, so in the last 5 minutes that I believe I have, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some research in progress that we have. And it's going to be on, this is all in the long run impact on institutional change of the Black Death. So obviously, the Black Death is generating a massive change in relative prices. Labor is becoming dear relative to capital and land. And this is going to reduce inequality, which you can talk to Guido Alfani about. But we wonder what impact did it have on institutional change? And one way we're thinking about this is in terms of the relative bargaining powers of owners of labor relative to owners of other factors. So the first thing I'll discuss is a little bit about craft guilds. Most of you know what craft guilds were. They're these early labor institutions. They're around from the 12th century. They're formal associations that act as kind of monopoly monopsonists. Like they have market power in the labor market, but also in the output market. Their authority is backed by political sanction. Okay, but the Black Death is going to impact the amount of power that these guilds have, we believe, in their cities, depending on potentially the mortality rates that they face. Channeling a little Douglas North, we know that relative prices dictate how individuals trade conditional on a set of institutions being present. That's Blackboard microtheory. But as North and others have discussed, when relative prices change, this also creates incentives to alter institutions. And we think that's what happened during the Black Death. And I go to one of my favorite people for this, Eli Heckscher. He talks about how the Great Pestilence led to a rise in prices, particularly wages, and the king took this as a motive for making the local bodies in Paris, especially the guilds, dependent on the royal institution. And he issued decrees that made it easier for strangers to practice their crafts within the town, and so on. Okay, I won't read the whole quote. If we collect data, and actually I shouldn't say we, so Sheila Ogilvy, has put together this really nice set of information, huge data set on guilds. I believe there's something like 12,000 observations in one of those data sets that basically is talking about guild activity. And we look at the mentions of guild activity for 274 cities that we have mortality rates for. And then we just look at what is the likelihood that you have a guild after 1400, conditional on your Black Death mortality rate. Then we see that the higher mortality rates, the less likely we're going to see mentions of guilds, okay, and after 1400. And this is all conditional on the population of the cities in 1300, and also on whether or not they had a guild already in 1300. Okay, so we think that's suggestive, but we're still doing work trying to clean up the data and do as good a job on it as we can. Last thing, and then I'm done, is, I'm done talking, is about this slide, is that did the Black Death encourage state formation? So this is an idea that's been out there as well, but the idea that we have is that the Black Death could have increased the relative price of labor and increased urbanization, and then this could increase the ability of the state to tax and to govern. There are a couple of reasons why this might have been. We're not completely sure we know yet why, but one reason might be that you're shifting wealth in effect from people who are hard to tax to people who are easier to tax, and that's one possibility. So the first step that we wanted to do is see if there's a correlation between the Black Death mortality rates and increases in state capacity. How do you do this? Like, we don't have good measures of state capacity, but one thing we can do is to look at the size of a state. And so what we do in many different ways, but this is one example, is we could take state boundaries in 1300, 1400, 1600, 1500, so on, and we impose grids on it. In this case, it's a 400-kilometer grid. And then we can just count how many states are within each of those grids. And if you think that places that are getting bigger geographically are increasing their capacity, then that's a rough measure of that for us. And we can extract the mortality rate on average in each of those grids using this map that you've already seen now. This is the third time, right? This inverse distance weighted map for the mortality rates. And when we do this, this is showing us two things, two local polynomial plots without confidence intervals, because that would have been really confusing. But this is also in the paper. You can see that places with higher Black Death mortality are seeing less number of states in a region. Okay, another way of saying that might be easier on our ears would be that places that have lower Black Death mortality rates see an increase in the number of states, whereas places with the higher rates are not seeing that, right? So less fractionalization of these states, you might think of it that way. The dashed line is the change in the number of states between 1300 and 1500 as a function of the Black Death mortality rate. The solid line is for 1300 to 1700. And the slope gets steeper, we think, as it gives it longer time, for these effects to take place. So I'm going to stop there because I think I've used my time up, but I'll just emphasize some of the things to take away. In my opinion, the Black Death is a huge demographic shock. We think it was also plausibly random. And so that's giving us a thing, to use to test lots of interesting theories that are out there. In the medium run, we think that markets were disrupted and growth was stalled. In the long run, cities endowed with better fixed fraction production recovered more quickly. And we think that it may have spurred institutional change that we can actually measure. So I will stop there. Would you like me to get rid of my screen? Probably. Is that good?
Yep.
Okay.
And we can see you full screen. Okay, so thank you, Noel, for a very interesting presentation. So I'd like to remind the audience that we have about 18 minutes of Q&A. So please post your questions using the Q&A tab, and I'll forward them to Noel to answer. And in 18 minutes or so, we'll have another 15 minutes of informal discussion. So let me use my my prerogative as moderator here to ask you a couple of related questions. I think they all evolve pretty much from the same observation. So your data is based on urban city mortality. Now, there's a lot of variation in the level of urbanization in Europe throughout this time. And we're basically missing, to a large extent, although I know there's some sparse evidence on mortality in countryside estates and different feudal estates, but can some of your results be attributed to this missing agricultural or non-urban population? For instance, the recovery of city, that's based on migration. I mean, most city growth in the Middle Ages is migration. It's not people, it's not in internal demographic growth, because it's huge death mortality of children in cities. So most of it is migration. So if you're in a heavily urban area, then the potential for migration, which is hard hit by the plague, your potential for recovery is much slower than countries or areas with a lot of agricultural population that might recover faster because they have more food or whatever, or they have been less hit, they were more healthy to begin with. I mean, all these variables. So that could be, say, one thing that could explain that. Another, again, related to these things is this state formation. So again, large states had probably more agricultural populations, say thinking about France or something like that. And therefore, they were less hit in some sense than small places, and therefore could have expanded more because they had more resources or whatever. So this, I'm saying, this missing variable of agricultural mortality or non-city could be a potential for explaining a variety of issues in your analysis. Related to that is, again, is the city size thing. And now sort of living in a city in Geneva, so it's not so much, I think, I mean, to some extent it's a city size, but it's also the density. So Geneva is very dense relative to most Swiss cities, for instance, and we have a higher contagion rate. I mean, that's part of the reason, is higher contagion rate because of density and not just the size of the population. So do you control for density as opposed to in the urban area as opposed to just size? I think.
Okay. Good. So Remy and Mark, feel free to jump in if you feel like it. I think I'll let them. We do have some evidence on walls, walled cities, which speaks to the density issue. There was a lot of questions in there. So one thing I'll mention, we don't have a huge amount of data at all, right? On rural mortality. To the extent that we're getting it wrong with the city data as opposed to what other people have. When we get our average mortality rate based on our city data, it's just about 40%, extremely close, just like everybody says on average for other places, but coming at it from a different angle, right? Slightly, right? And so that's, I think, a good thing. The thing that the couple slides that I skipped because I noticed I was running out of time, they were on missing villages, villages that deserted villages in England. There's a large data set out there that we didn't collect on that, right? And what we find there is exactly consistent with what you said, right? That the places where you see the most deserted villages are going to be where the mortality rate is relatively low, but they are also far away from the nearest city, relatively far. So they're on marginal land, right? In a place where there's not a, and they're moving, to cities where they can be paid more, right? That's basically, so there's definitely that process is going on. I think what you said about the state formation and having, that's interesting. Right, and I'll have to think about it more. That research is such an early stage. I think we could probably do something, to control for that. Right, just take a look at, what is the urban density, relative to good agricultural land, all sorts of things like that, to see if that's related. But those are my initial thoughts, and there we probably could also do something. Oh, go ahead, Mark. Yeah.
Yeah, I can just briefly add, I mean, you've covered most of the points. So David Herliffy had a study of Pistola in Northern Italy, and his data is different to kind of data we have, and it suggests rural depopulation of the same level of magnitude as urban depopulation. So is that all plague, or could that be some migration? It's hard to disentangle, but the chronicler's report suggests there's as severe in the countryside as in the cities. And then the other piece of evidence, which is the 19th century bubonic plague outbreak in India and China, where rural areas which actually hit harder than urban areas. And one reason why that might be is because of a distribution of these black rats being very territorial. So they could be as densely populated in rural, semi-rural areas as in cities. So the density of a rat population could be not correlated with density of human population. That's the hypothesis for why density and city size doesn't seem to predict mortality rates, and why we think that rural mortality was very high. But as you said, and as you know, it's much harder to measure rural mortality rates. People are not reporting them in the same way they're reporting city mortality rates.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to some of the questions in the QA. So Chris Mitchner is asking, what are the appropriate counterfactuals for real wage? And I guess it could be applied to almost anything else, is what are the counterfactuals? What would have happened without the Black Death in a series of your variables?
Mark, do you want to take that? Yeah. Yeah, sure.
So I was answering some of the questions as they appeared live, but I logged in and logged out, so I couldn't reply to Chris's question. So obviously we don't have it's hard. So it's hard. That's a hard question. We know for England pretty well what real wages were before and after, and so they're low in the early 14th century. And then there's a somewhat of a rise in the 1330s, 1340s, I believe, but they were very low. And so in general, a Malthusian model seems to do a good job of predicting why they were low. England's population is, again, this is disputed, but people like Bruce Campbell and others have discussed whether it was 6 million or 4.5 million, and the population estimate is going to play a role in assessing how close England was to its kind of Malthusian carrying capacity. But if you imagine there's no demographic shock in England in the mid 14th century, and the population stays at around between 4.5 or 6 million, then your prediction would be that real wages would be close to subsistence, and it would stay close to subsistence, maybe fluctuating a little bit as the temperature changes or as you get other shocks. But so that's that's the best thing we could do with counterfactual. It's not great because we don't have a natural control group. But for England, it would stay Malthusian. It might be the control, but the counterfactual might be different for Spain, based on kind of research which has been done on whether Spain was relatively depopulated compared to, say, England before the Black Death. And it could be very different for Italy, which is more urbanized and more commercialized.
Okay, so, thank you. Yeah. Noel,
did you want me just to look at the questions, or do you want to read them off? Or
well, so we have a bunch of these. Sorry, just you can read them, and I'll just read them to the audience.
Okay. Oh yeah. I just didn't know what the information constraints were on the audience.
Yeah. No, it's fine.
Yeah. Okay. So the next one is Lon Peters. The market access slide shows every location in the same green color, and the black line is not labeled. I'm not sure what the conclusion is. If there is time, could we review? I'm happy to do that, although I don't want to get into the weeds necessarily about how market access is calculated, because I'll be boring my co-authors to death, right? Because they're tired of listening to me talk about that probably. But that was just a slide to, if the resolution was high enough, on our screens, that green image of Europe would actually have gradations in it, and there was a key on the right that basically it had all the transportation networks we can find, so rivers, seas, land, and medieval routes and Roman roads, and then it's those are color coded by what the cost of traveling on them is from historical estimates that we collect from like 4 different sources. It's like separate parameter estimates, right, to test. And it makes mainly green because green happened to be portage, right? Where there is no road, and that's what mostly you have. And then the market access calculation is basically to calculate the least cost travel paths through those transportation routes between all the different dyads of the cities, and then you use that, as your weight. You're in the 1 over that raised to some proportion, right? Or raised to some number, to discount cities that are farther away, from you by these least cost travel paths. So in that line you saw was, if I was going slower, this is a very fast talk, right? That was just the least cost travel path between Paris and Rome, to give you an example that they don't look completely unreasonable. So I don't want to, I could bring it back up and talk about it more, but I think that's what was going on there. And it's not in the paper, but you can see it in the appendix to our paper, that's working paper on the impact of the Black Death on cities. Okay. Next, I guess I'm still looking at Gustavo Leiva. Wait, okay, and all those columns, the number 1 by construction estimate is included. I am confused. Was the null here? What are the stars in the K show? So this is obviously an example of where it would be better if he could yell at me while I was talking, because I don't know exactly what I was talking about at 12:25. Does Mark or Remy can you tell from like looking at that?
No, I think they were about the recovery regressions, but maybe it's better. I can talk. There are some other questions now which are answered, which might be more interesting in general. I don't know if you have anything like so I can there's might be more. So I've already answered some of these, but Malcolm McAdam was interested in the decline of feudalism. So and I think our result. So his question was: did Black Death accelerate the decline of feudalism due to high mortality rates among peasants and resulting labor shortages? And so the tables we didn't get to show about deserted villages speak to that to some degree. So you have people, the cities are being repopulated by people moving out of more marginal lands in the countryside. Is our finding, and I just said in my answers, this is consistent with the work of Mark Bainey, who's a historian who's got a lot of data from East Anglia, who tracks the decline of serfdom at the village and manorial level. It's it's only a few villages, so it's not something you can put into a regression analysis, but it takes decades. So these processes play out over decades, but they put a consistent pattern, at least for England, with deserted villages, real wages, and urbanization all moving in a way you'd expect based on kind of our theoretical framework.
Thank you. Can I ask another question related to? I mean, this is not in your JEL paper, but something that is interesting, and since you've researched the Black Death, and something that I've worked on many years ago, not necessarily in the context of Black Death, but I'm thinking about the sort of monetary international trade consequences of this. So there's this whole thing that I once wrote about, this bullion famine thing, about the fact that there was no minting. So, and some people interpret it as a recession and as sort of in a sort of a Keynesian way. But according to your story, and because recovery rates are slow and the coins don't die, I mean, that's the alternative. So you have a lot of metal in Europe, and then you have this trade deficits that people have documented. And so if you're moving from a closed economy type of analysis, which your JL paper seems to, I mean, there's very little mention of trade. And how does that come into the picture? This, the fact that there's mini globalization occurring in terms of Europe beginning to import substantially during this time.
Nathan, you're probably one of the best people for us to talk to on this. So we didn't talk too much about monetary issues because in the 14th century, precisely because there's this debate which you referred to between the bullionists and the Malthusians. So we didn't. That's it seems to me quite a murky debate, and it's still contentious between people who. Yeah, so, is there depression in the 15th century? Is it due to a lack of coinage? And so we didn't want to open that up too much. I think we mentioned it briefly. So you may know more about that issue than we do. What is the case is in the initial impact of a Black Death is inflationary. So you can think about it as a negative supply shock, and you can also think about if the amount of coinage circulating in the short run is fixed relatively. Initially, you see a lot of inflation. So the first kind of 10 years roughly of a Black Death, and that's partly why real wages don't rise at all. Nominal wages rise, but not real wages for at least 10 years. So the first effect is inflationary for sure. Then it seems to be, and this is from memory, I haven't read this stuff recently. It seems to be that there's a because there's this inflationary effect, there seems to be an abandonment of a lot of these silver mines in Central Europe. And so the monetary story seems to be first inflationary, then later deflationary. And I'm just not, when we were researching this paper, we kind of made a conscious decision that the paper was already too long. We were already getting, we already went over the word count given to us by the JLE. So we made a conscious decision not really to go into that topic, but I think it's important. And the way we look at trade is this market access measure, because so we don't have direct measures of the absolute volumes of trade going on. But I know from England, again, and we might have to restrict our attention to England to answer this question better. We know from England that the world trade collapses. So the volume of wool exports from England, it peaks in the 1340s, and it doesn't recover really to the 16th, 17th century. So the world trade totally collapses, and that has important implications for the state finances and for city growth as well. But it's just trade volume is not something which is measurable at the Europe-wide level in a way that we can aggregate.
Yeah, but those aggregate regressions that I showed you, like the first ones after just the recovery ones for the cities, I think there could be multiple explanations for why we see that. You know, that places that, like regions measured in various ways that on average had higher mortality rates also shrank more, right, in the 50 years afterwards. Like, I really think, I mean, doing that for all of Europe, I think is consistent, right? You know, like, you know, with, you know, this, I think I said the word many times, like trade disintermediation, right? You know, like that's taking place, a collapse, right? You know, during that period. And so, and I think, I don't want to stick my foot in my mouth, right? You know, but it's I don't know that there's a consistent measure of that, right? You know, across Europe, you know, other than, you know, what we've managed to put together, like for those city populations right there. Yeah, but trade flows, yeah, we don't have.
Well, I mean, it's just a question of how do you, I mean, that's maybe for a sequel paper or some other research, but I think, I mean,
Yeah.
I think your work can illuminate some of that debate, which is also a big historical debate, as Mark mentioned. So,
Yeah.
given the amount of research you did, so I guess we ended up with we sort of reached to the end of the formal part of this online seminar. And again, I'd like to thank our speakers. Noel Johnson, is both of Mark and Remy, who joined us as well today. And I'd like to remind people that we meet next week in a paper that actually fits in within the end of your presentation, talking about state capacity and the rise and fall of serfdom in Europe. So I think that kind of fits well with the end part of your presentation. And so I'd like to thank you again. And now we move on to those people interested to the last 15 minutes of a more informal debate. And we have a few more questions on the Q&A that we can address and during that time, and also talk about other things.
And thank you for everybody who came to listen. Yeah, that's very, very kind. And we appreciate the feedback and the questions as well. And I'm ready for more. Okay, so let's move to the other questions. I don't know if you, Mark, you answered Michelle and Laura. You're muted, Mark. Yeah. Mark? You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Michelle's question, I didn't answer it fully, so maybe that's
yes, it's a good question, I think, and it's interesting for so. So I think if you want to answer it online.
I'll read it. I can read it out. Given insecurity following the first two waves of plagues after 1560, there are many large bands of mercenaries on the roads in France, Italy, and Spain. Might it be that bigger countries were also more able to fight these bands than smaller ones? It might also be the war between France and England strengthened those monarchies, as unpopular taxes were needed in both countries to fund the war against the other country. And the Black Death made the war last for 100 years. So I can answer that. We thought about this. We don't have any results so far. So in some sense, you need a theory, a model, which we don't yet have, about how this demographic shock should affect states' ability to tax and states' ability to raise armies. And so the initial effect of the Black Death is actually to pause the 100 Years' War. There's no fighting really between about 1349 and 1354, no major fighting, no English invasions of France. So the initial effect is the Black Death is here, international conflict dies down for about 5 years, then it resumes. But as Michelle mentioned, in 1360, there's peace between England and France, and in the historical literature, there's this huge problem of mercenaries. So there are these mercenaries, John Hawkwood's the most famous, roaming around Italy, causing devastation. From our perspective, what we're thinking about is whether or not this demographic shock improves the ability of states to fight. You might think that if per capita income goes up and population goes down, that might allow states to collect more revenues per person, at least. And there's certainly some evidence for this in England, and I think in France as well. So that's one of the mechanisms we're thinking about in terms of more money, more tax revenue per person. But at the same time, there are fewer people. 40% mortality. Population of England, more than half, essentially by 1450, means armies are smaller, and so you might have the switch to more capital-intensive warfare. So armies which are now full of better trained, smaller numbers of soldiers, and that could also encourage the adoption of more capital-intensive military technologies like artillery, cannon, arquebuses, guns. And so this is going to feed into the state capacity literature in a rich and interesting way. We don't have any answers yet. That's just some of the stuff we're thinking about.
And I would also, I don't know if you mentioned it, Mark, but I don't know if it happened, but I think it almost had to have happened, that you're redistributing income across people with different political power, different, within society at this time as well, right? And so if you think about the state building itself in opposition to local feudal institutions, you are you're allowing the state, right? Those local feudal institutions are, the state is able to extract revenue from individuals who have less traditional protections, for example, from the ability of the state to tax, or they're just in a less good position, right? To prevent that from happening, right? And so that's another angle I think probably is relevant, in there. That's a fascinating area.
Yeah, Rui had a question, so.
Yeah, and it's picking up precisely on the political side. So I understand that you don't have a model and you have some hypotheses on what might connect Black Death mortality with territorial consolidation. But looking at the map, I'm guessing that most of the variation comes from the Holy Roman Empire, which had its own mechanisms of progressive political dispersion. Right, so cheap question is: do the results hold without the Roman Empire in the sample? And if they don't, what can you say about it?
Yeah, and your eye is correct, right? A lot of the variation is being driven by the Holy Roman Empire, because that also is an area, if you remember, like the second map I showed in the talk, where there's relatively low mortality rates, right? But that's also an area where you have a lot of fragmentation. With the results, they stand up, but they get weaker, right? If you get rid of the Holy Roman Empire. And of course, a lot of it, it depends on what size grids you're looking at, and all these other sorts of questions like this. But it does still work, but it works a lot better when the Holy Roman Empire is there. And it's not clear that that's going to be the same story, as we would have, like whether it's the same story across the entire continent, right? So it's a good question.
Yeah, we have another.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Rui, is that fine? Is that okay?
Well, there was a cheap side of my question, which you just answered, right? So if you exclude the Holy Roman Empire, the results sort of still hold.
They're still there. Yeah.
Because I guess most of the adjustments will be done on the borders, as is obvious, right? So you have quite a bit of adjustment along the border between France and however you define the empire. You might have a lot of consolidation in the north of Italy, right? Mm-hmm. But then, was this not happening before as well, before the plague? These are obvious points of contention between what will become big nation states, right? So irrespectively, my question is, what's the counterfactual, right? Would they accelerate? Would they be slower in the absence of the plague? So I guess that's the less cheap version of the question.
No, it's not cheap. I presented it, right? And it's actually that's just also in the JEL paper, right? That we didn't include anything on guilds there, but we did include the state formation, almost exactly what I just showed you in the talk. I think we might do it. We can. So the counterfactual that if I just believe what I did or what we did empirically, there is that if Black Death mortality rates had been higher, like, in the area of the Holy Roman Empire, then there would have been more consolidation, right? That would be the counterfactual story, that we would tell. Now, this is research in progress. I'm not sure I want to die on that hill, right? Because it requires a lot more knowledge about institutional detail, right? And doing things like seeing if we can even find enough variation within the region, right? To try to test that in a better way. But this is always a danger. Well, not danger, a difficulty, right? In using these data are that we argue that they're random, but then we often sometimes use these averages, across the, we're using the spatial interpolation, which suggests that there is spatial correlation, right? Across these, which there is some, right? And so then there's always the issue of what is the appropriate spatial unit of analysis, right? That you're getting to what you want. I don't know if that got too technical, but it's but your intuition is correct, and we're still working on coming up with whether or not the counterfactual that I just stated, is going to be, really what's going on, right? In that case, coming up with ways to test that.
Yeah. So we have another question from David Mitch, who's been asking you a lot of questions. So maybe David, I unmuted you, and maybe you can ask her questions.
Hi, David.
Unmute yourself.
Yeah. Well, I think Mark answered most of them. Actually, there's two further questions that sort of came to mind, or reactions. One is just your finding of, and I didn't, there's a lot you presented. I haven't sort of absorbed all of it, but your finding about these random variations in mortality across cities. And I wanted to look more at how big the variation is in this randomness, and sort of just, I guess, some underlying skepticism about how random that could be, or there must be some underlying factors if there's sort of big variations in that. So that's one area. I think the other area I wanted to know more about was what you were finding about cities and some of this persistence of cities that had initial advantages, and the issue of whether or not urban structure, urban hierarchies changed much due to the Black Death. So for example, did London and I thought the emergence of London in particular as sort of the dominant area of England sort of occurred after the Black Death period, but I'm just wondering about that sort of set of issues, and I guess same would apply to Paris. But,
I'll take the first bit. So there are things that are correlated with the mortality rates. I mentioned one of them, but maybe it happened too quickly in the talk, which is that the virulence of the Black Death was higher like earlier on in its spread than later on in its spread. And this is just something that happens very often with diseases, right? Because immunity is developed and so forth. And so the mortality rates go down, over time. And so that's why latitude is actually correlated, with the Black Death mortality rates. And we actually exploit that as a source of an instrumental variable, where we can use as an instrument to predict the mortality rates, your distance from Messina, right? And then conditioning on some things, right? That will take away potential confoundings. Another thing that's correlated with the mortality rates is there's going to be a seasonal component, which we also can exploit, as an instrument when we do not in the JEL paper. I can't believe I've forgotten. Mark, do you remember when it was more virulent? It was over the month?
It's virulent when it's warm. So in Northern European summer. So fleas are most active when it's between about 17 and 23 or something centigrade. So getting the plague takes several months, maybe 3 months on average, to work its way through a city. So getting the plague in, say, April means you're most likely or May, you're screwed basically. Whereas getting the plague in maybe December means the fleas are less likely to be active. So that seems to be associated, on average at least, with a slightly less virulent outbreak.
Yeah, I want to add that, I don't know if you can hear me. Yeah.
So we can, oh good,
yeah, I want to add that we try to rely on this exogeneity here, and assuming that if the disease comes in April versus in February, it's kind of exogenous, conditioning on the factors and all of that. But I think Mark is right, it's April and May.
Okay, good, yeah. So David, you're right that there are some things, right, that are correlated with it, but we are just trying to exclude the ones that would matter to the particular thing, right, that we are arguing at any particular moment.
Actually, now that I think about it, I mean, the seasonality part makes sense. And then I'm just thinking, if we think of COVID in the United States, there's a lot of variation, and it doesn't necessarily match up with mask wearing and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's not that implausible. So
right. And then you had a question about changing in the urban hierarchies, like some of the politics of the urban regions. Mark,
well, not necessarily politics, but I'm just wondering in terms of urban, standing. I mean, the classic ones would be sort of the standing of London and Paris in the countries, but and whether the Black Death had much impact on that.
That's actually an interesting question, especially related to the state formation one. It might be something to look into. To what extent did you have a consolidation, of a population in a center, right? Or something like this. I don't know if anybody's taken a look at that, but we could.
Yeah. We've not looked at the hierarchy yet. We should, maybe, for this political angle, but for city size, we know this. We've studied this quite a lot, and so there isn't. The way we framed it is there's no total urban reset after Black Death, but there are permutations in this distribution of cities. And so in general, cities like London and Paris were already large, by relatively speaking, not in absolute terms. So like London had 50,000, or probably more than 50,000 people. So London and Paris are already somewhat large before the Black Death. So the Black Death doesn't lead to a city which is like London collapsing and then a new city rising. Where a lot of the action is at the middle range of a city distribution. So there's cities like Montpellier in France, which are about fourth, I think, in the urban hierarchy in France in 1300. And after the Black Death, they have a very high mortality rate, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, at least relatively smaller. So less and less of an important city. Whereas Hamburg in the Holy Roman Empire, it's relatively small before the Black Death, and its growth accelerates after. The counterfactual is hard to assess, but you see a lot of churn in that middle tier of cities, but you don't see big capital cities like Paris suddenly shrink because they get hit hard by the Black Death. And I think our regressions are speaking to that. They're explaining what factors predict your recovery, and these fixed factors. In fact, London is a great location, right, already. So no matter how hard hit it is by the Black Death, we might expect it to recover, and it does recover very quickly.
Yeah. And somebody who has there is some Jeremiah Dittmar has a paper on whether or not the cities in Europe were distributed by the zip, the log distribution, right? And what he argues in there is that for a long time during the medieval period, the big cities weren't big enough to fit that distribution the way it does in modern time. And he has an explanation based on decreasing costs of trade. I haven't seen a recent version of that paper though, so I don't know if that's evolved over time. But that speaks a little bit to perhaps your point as well, David, about whether the big cities are getting bigger or not. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we exploited all our time frame, so we should end, I guess. And I'd like to thank you again for joining us and for staying the extra 15 minutes. I think we had a very lively Q&A session, a lively discussion, and generated a lot of interest. So thank you for that.
Thank you again for inviting us. And this is always the most bizarre thing at these Zoom seminars, because now we all just log out and disappear.
And say goodbye. Yeah.
It's like, there's no meal. They're like, yeah, okay.
No beers, no meal.
No beer. Yeah,
unfortunately, yeah. I'm back.
I really enjoyed it. So thanks again for the invitation.